So I guess we'll get started. I hear rumor there is coffee coming, so if you keep your eye out, there should be eventually some coffee. Thank you guys for all coming out tonight. So for those of you who don't know, this event is being put on by the Stockton area atheists and free thinkers and the Stanislaus humanists, who I am representing tonight. I'm just filling in for David Diskin, who's usually here to do introductions. So thanks, of course, goes out to those two groups, and then also all of our volunteers who make this possible, setting up chairs, getting the library rented, grabbing the keys, and the coffee that hopefully is coming. And then thank you to the mentee of the library, and of course, Dr. Strand, who's here to speak with us tonight. So who are we? Most of us already know who are here. It seems like this is our base group, but we're just a community of non-believers, and we focus on community involvement, social events, events like tonight for education and information, and activism. So we have a lot of upcoming events. We do coffees and brunches, dinners, karaoke's, art hops, craft nights, movie nights. We have book club, actually at my house, game nights, family events, and then volunteering, and a whole bunch of other things. So if you're interested in getting more involved, then you can check out our websites, which will be coming up. We do colloquiums every other month on Wednesdays. So upcoming, we have Matt McCormick speaking on March 18th, and then also Greta Christina coming July 15th. So just over here still at the library. We're really excited for our Darwin Day celebration that is coming up, our first one ever on February 7th. There will be a birthday cake celebration over here in the park. And we're going to have guest speakers, Jerry DeWitt from Louisiana and Ryan Bell, and they're going to be talking about their shift from belief to disbelief, basically. And then we're also going to have Glenn Branch there, talking about evolution, in schools. So, Sacramento Free Thought Day coming up way in the future, over here on October 12th. And if you're interested in getting involved more, we always need more volunteers, help with social media and marketing, and event hosts. So if you have something, a void to fill in our group, if you want to host a book club, if you want to host something like that, then we'll get in touch with one of us, head to one of our websites, Stockton Area Atheists, StocktonAAF.org, or StanislausHumanist.org, and you can see all of our events that are upcoming and ways that you can get involved. So, of course, we need support for these events, and we don't necessarily pass the basket, but we do have one over on the table. If you want to slip in $5, $10, $20 on your way out, that would be very helpful. It helps to cover the insurance that we need to come to the library here, advertising fees, and of course speaker fees, and so you can drop off some money there if you feel so inclined. Also take note, at the table we have a lot of literature over there tonight. You can grab, there's stickers, there's humanism, critical thinking. If you want to know more about the humanist or Stockton area atheist groups, we have more literature at the table. And finally, Camp Quest. This is a secular camp for kids, summer camp, and registration is now open for July. If you're interested in, maybe you have some kids that, and the coffee's here. Sweet. So maybe you have somebody who would be interested in being a part of Camp Quest or in volunteering at Camp Quest, then I believe it's at campquest.org. All right, and finally, who we're waiting to hear from is Dr. Sarah Strand. She has a PhD in Behavioral Neuroscience from the University of Massachusetts, professor in the psychology department at Sacramento State University, teaches on statistics, animal behavior, learning theory, sensation and perception, and introductory psychology, and has been lecturing on evolution and neurobiology of religion. She actually has a set of lectures that she's been doing over the past 5 years in Sacramento and San Francisco area, and she's putting that set of lectures together into a book that she is currently authoring, so you'll want to keep your eye out for that when it comes out. And let's see, I think this is the end of all of my announcements, so without further ado, thank you so much, Dr. Strand.
Thank you, Charlie, for the introduction, and for everybody for coming tonight. As Charlie said, this is the first part of what I'm designing as a 3-part series on neurobiology of religion. The first one here, we're going to talk about the evolution of religion. This is a talk that's centered around how religion has changed, the origin of religion. We're going to talk a little bit about Darwin, because Darwin, as we know, is the godfather of evolution, so no evolution talk can really proceed without an introduction by him. And I'll touch on a little bit some of the other talks as I proceed throughout this one. If you're interested in hearing the next one, feel free to let me know, and I'd be happy to come back and talk with you guys. Now, as Charlie mentioned, I've been giving iterations of this talk for the last 5 years or so. And what I've learned, the talk has expanded, it's been updated, I've refined it and streamlined it. But one thing that I've noticed, you are the Stockton area atheists and freethinkers. I understand that there's some Stanislaus representatives here as well from the humanist organization. But one thing that I've noticed is that atheists tend to be all too eager to jump on the bandwagon of religion is bad, bad, bad. So one thing that I've learned is that it's helpful if at the beginning of my talk I say that's not what I'm going to conclude with tonight. So if you guys are upset and need to leave, grab a bucket of rotten tomatoes and bring it back and start throwing at me, I'll make sure to get my raincoat out and flee before that actually happens. What I do want to do is present a case whereby religion is not that confusing an idea in terms of how it has appeared in human history since the beginning of humankind. And what I'd like to do is present a case whereby you can see how it may have happened, how it has evolved over time, and if religion isn't that surprising an idea to be present in human culture, then how on earth are atheists here as well? So that's going to be my goal throughout the talk tonight. I'm going to cover, no. Can you guys see that? No, really all that well. Okay. So I'm going to first start off talking about how something that doesn't involve genes can evolve. Okay. There was this idea that the genetic, or the component in terms of cultural evolution is called the meme, that was first proposed by Richard Dawkins back in the 70s. And then I'm going to go on to discuss the origins of religion from 3 distinct biopsychological viewpoints. And then I'm going to finish up with how evolution itself has evolved over time. There's no speakers, are there? That's okay. I'm going to turn up my volume because we're going to probably need it here in just a second. Okay. So first off, no, I meant for the video that I'm going to play, but thank you. First off, evolution is based on 2 main requirements. Evolution requires both variability and heritability. Now, why would we need variability? Well, in order for a particular trait to be better than another trait in a particular environment, so that it can be selected and make that particular individual have a greater likelihood of survivability, there has to be some variation in the traits that are present in that particular environment. Second, that trait has to be able to be passed on to future generations. So that trait has to be heritable. All right. So when we're talking about genetic evolution of physical traits, we have to have variability and we have to have heritability. All right. So we ask ourselves then, when we're talking about culture, when we're talking about ideas evolving, can we say that culture has variation?
Sure.
It's reasonable. Seems like a reasonable idea. Yeah. Okay. Is culture heritable? Not genetically. Very, very, very good. But can it be passed from person to person? Okay, now you guys are being smarty pants. You guys have already answered the question, so maybe I should just skip over the monkey video that I have prepared for you that's hosted by David Attenborough. Should I just skip right over that? No? Okay. You want to take back your answer and say, I don't know, Dr. Strand, let's tell her.
I like monkeys.
Okay, so we're going to watch a brief documentary hosted by David Attenborough. The TV episode, or the TV show is called Life on Earth, and this particular episode is called Life in the Trees. There's about a 2-minute video clip where he introduces a particular type of macaque that has been able to pass particular behavioral traits across many generations. So hopefully you'll be able to hear this. I have it turned up all the way.
Macaques live in many parts of Japan, and one population of them has become famous all over the world for their inventiveness. These live on a tiny offshore island called Kashima, where an isolated troop, and they made some remarkable changes in their behavior. For a long time, it used to think that the way species like this is not easy. But then in 1952, the Charles Darwin decided that in order to entice the monkeys out of the open so they could observe them more closely, they started off with like that. After about a year, a young female called Emo began to take her roots down to a pool and wash off the standard mud before eating it. Within a few weeks, her close friends and her family, including her mother, were copying her. The habit spread, and 10 years later, almost all the monkeys on the island habitually washed their sweet potatoes. Then a new variation arose. Instead of using fresh water, the monkeys took the roots down to the sea and washed them there, even when they were clean already. Perhaps they simply liked salt on their potatoes. Only the very old didn't adopt the new customs. The young were quick to learn, and the fact that they just travelled on their mother's back meant that they saw exactly what she was doing at all times, an unexpected benefit of having grasping hands. Then the scientists changed the diet to unhusked rice. They wanted to keep the monkeys in one place so that they could observe them, and they reckoned it would take them a long time to pick up the rice from the sand, but they reckoned without Emo. She grabbed handfuls of rice and sand together and threw the whole lot into the water. The sand sank, the rice floated, and she quickly skipped it off. And once again, the habit spread.
You guys can hear me okay without the microphone? So this is a great non-human example of how certain behaviors will be passed throughout a particular society. Now, this society was somewhat unusual with respect to the scientists provisioning them with food, right? But one thing that the video that David Attenborough cited is that even after 10 years, individuals in this particular troop were still performing this particular behavior. So this is a fairly remarkable pattern of behavior that was initiated by one person, one individual, and then spread throughout the entire colony of monkeys in this particular area. So I will ask this question again. Can cultural behaviors and culture be passed from one individual to the next? Yes, it sure can. But you didn't come here to learn about non-human primates tonight, so we're gonna shift this discussion to the evolution of culture in terms of humans. Now, as I said, Richard Dawkins back in '76 coined the term meme when he first started talking about it in his book, The Selfish Gene. And in this book, he postulated that a meme is to cultural evolution as a gene is to genetic evolution. All right, so he's saying that a meme is very similar in how it acts and what it's responsible for, just as a gene is responsible for passing along bits of genetic information. Specifically, in the book, he says, just as genes propagate themselves in the gene pool by leaping from body to body via sperm and eggs, so do memes propagate themselves in the meme pool by jumping from mind to mind via processes like imitation. Okay? But when we talk about memes, or specifically the field of memetics, what exactly are we talking about? The field of memetics can be split into two main schools of thought. We've got the internalist view and the externalist view. And this is mostly divided in terms of how these different memeticists define what a meme is. Internalists view a meme as a unit of information that can be located specifically in the brain. Okay, so internalist memeticists are going to rely a lot on technology such as functional MRIs and those kinds of things to locate and observe activity in the brain. Externalists, on the other hand, define memes as a unit of information that only can be observed. We can only observe it from the outside via certain kinds of behavior. Okay? There are still others that view each of these as acceptable and valid interpretation of what a meme is. Whether you define it by looking inside the brain or looking outside the brain, all memeticists agree that memes have two main qualities. The first quality is that it is a unit of information that can be passed from mind to mind. So examples of this can be things like habits, skills, songs, stories, and really any other type of idea or information. Okay, you guys with me so far? Let's do an example. How exactly does a unit of information get passed from mind to mind? Well, here I have a timeline. Okay, this is a timeline for the development of electricity. All right? The idea for electricity started in 1752 with Ben Franklin, who for some reason thought it would be a good idea to attach a key to a string that was attached to a kite. He got himself electrocuted, but he learned that there's something that can be harnessed by doing that. About 50 years later, that idea was harnessed by Alessandro Volta, who created the first electric battery. Okay? Moving forward another 20 years, Michael Faraday invented the first electric motor, after which J.C. Maxwell created the laws of electrodynamics, which really talked about how electricity and magnetic fields are generated and altered by each other and by charges and currents. Okay? Now, harnessing those laws, the next big leap came another 20 years later when Thomas Edison invented the first long-lasting light bulb. Now, there were light bulbs already in existence at this time, but they burned out fairly quickly. They weren't really much use in terms of lighting our existences once the sun went down. But Thomas Edison was able to harness that electricity and channel it into the first long-lasting light bulb. Next, only a few years later, Nikola Tesla developed the first alternating current system, which was able to transfer electricity long distances. And we end with the culmination of all of this effort for James Spangler to develop the first electric suction sweeper, also known as the vacuum. That's really where all this was going, the vacuum. All right, so this is an idea, one small idea that was transferred over the course of about 150 years from how do we harness this energy to I need to clean my house with it, okay? That is an example of how a unit of information can be passed from mind to mind over several generations, okay? The second quality is that memes are in competition for survival. Not all memes are created equal. All right, for example, there are many examples of celebrities texting. Many examples of pictures of celebrities texting. Okay, we're going to test your cultural IQ here. Who do we have on the far left? Russell Brand, followed by Ethan Hawke with his baby. And then we've got, I don't know who the gentleman on the left is, but on the right, that's Elizabeth Hurley. And then we have Robert De Niro and some producer on the right there, okay? Is this the first time that you have seen these pictures before?
No.
Yes.
Possibly, yes, probably. You say no. Really? You've seen one of these pictures before? Oh, you're kidding. Okay. How about this one? Everybody has seen that one. Not only do you know what this is and what this is referring to, you have probably also seen many, many iterations of something like this. In the top frame, we've got Barack Obama saying, "Hey, Hill, what you doing?" Responded by her saying, "Running the world." And there are many, many iterations of these, this particular meme of Hillary responding to texts. We've got, what's his face from Facebook sending a friend request. What's his name? Sorry. Zuckerberg, yes, Mark Zuckerberg. I didn't know. And then Hillary responding with reject. Barack Obama, we did it 4 more years. She says keep the seat warm. Hashtag Hillary 2016. And then Hillary talking with Wendy Davis, who is famous for her long filibuster trying to prevent a pretty extensive abortion blocking bill from passing in Texas. Hey girl, time for lunch. Wendy saying lunch is for wimps. Hillary texting back, you're a badass. There are many, 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 many examples of this particular celebrity texting that has been that has populated the internet, and it's died down a little bit by this point. But the point is that not all memes are created equal, right? That there are certain memes that just tend to take off, and there are other memes that just kind of die without anybody really paying much attention to them. So what is one of the most successful memes of all time? Okay. Religion is made up of ideas, and each religion is composed of different ideas. However, there are some universals that can be found among all of these different kinds of religions. Most of religions have certain morals, certain memes for morals, no killing, no stealing, no blaspheming. Most religions have sexual memes and morals, right? Don't you dare step a toe outside of what I myself think is appropriate for you to do. That's generally the theme of most sexual norms. And there's also a very strong meme about out-groups that exist in certain religions. Now this is a psychological term, and does anybody know what the term out-group would refer to? Anybody that's not in your group. Exactly. So all of us belong to this group, but I don't know if any of you belong to the Sacramento Freethinkers, Atheists, and Non-Believers in Sacramento.
Heretics!
Heretics! Horrible people! Right? So there's a very strong cultural message when you're in a particular religious group, or any group for that matter, that anybody who's in your group is great, and anybody who's in other groups, there must be something wrong with them. Okay? So this is how ideas, culture, religion can evolve through the process of mimetic transmission. So let's move on to talking about the origins of religion. From a cultural, behavioral standpoint, where did religion come from? Now, to answer this question, or it has been at least attempted to be answered by many, many, many scientific domains. We're talking, anthropologically, examining history and how religion came to be, looking at archaeology, looking at different historical remnants. I went to Italy for 3 weeks this past June, and steps away from the Colosseum, we were just winding our way back home again. Steps away, we found an underground Mithraeum that was buried underneath this church that had existed for 700-800 years. You could actually pay €5 to go down and take a tour of what had existed thousands and thousands of years ago. It was quite amazing. So there are lots of different ways that the origins of religion have been examined. As Charlie mentioned when she introduced me, I am a psychologist. My PhD is in behavioral neuroscience. And so from my perspective, what I can knowledgeably communicate to you is the origin of religion from a biological psychology standpoint. And biological psychology examines the biological underpinnings of psychological phenomenon. So tonight I'm going to talk about 3 different origins of religion based on 3 different biopsychological standpoints: cognitive psychology, social psychology, and briefly on neurotheology. Okay? So let's start off talking about the cognitive origin of religion. The way that we as humans think about new information actually facilitates a belief in the supernatural. What I mean by that is that if something happens to us that we can't really explain, we tend to posit that someone or something caused this thing to happen to us, okay? This is called an agent detection device, and it can also be referred to as animism. Animism you might recognize as one of the earliest forms that religion took before, back in, caveman kind of days, before society really started to cooperate and come together and build the societies that we know and recognize today. Animism is where inanimate objects and ambiguous events are thought to be animated by some kind of sentient agent, okay? This is important because this reminds me of an article I read. I know this is low on the screen, but this is an article called "Bad is Stronger Than Good" that was published over 10 years ago. But one of the most interesting ideas about this article is that our experiences, our negative experiences, mean more to us, stick with us longer than our good experiences. And the authors of this paper very succinctly described an explanation for why this might be. In other words, life, in order to live, life has to succeed every single day of our lives. But death only has to win once, right? And so as a developing culture, as a developing human society, anything bad that might happen, whether it's, a tree snapping or a twig snapping off in the distance that we can't see, a really bad thunderstorm, a tornado, some kind of hurricane, any of those really negative events, it's kind of second nature. It's sort of our default to attribute, to explain those things as if someone or something did it. Now, you might think that, okay, animism isn't necessarily alive and well in current society, but there are plenty of examples of animism being used in humorous situations. So here are a couple of cartoons that I want to show you. There's the first one. Okay. Those chocolate bunnies probably aren't talking to each other, but we think it's funny. We can identify with that. Here's another one. Okay. We infuse personality into the toothbrush and the toilet paper as they talk about how horrible their days are. And then my personal favorite. It's a cob of corn that asks the other cob of corn, is it hot out? And the cob of corn that's coming in is all like popcorn and says, shut up. My personal favorite, I am from Minnesota. My fiance is a native here of Sacramento. When it's, 85, I start to feel like I'm going to melt. Whereas when it's about 50, he starts to feel like an ice cube. So we have kind of a narrow range of overlapping, mutually agreeable temperatures. Okay, so this is an example. These are examples of animistic humor, that we are essentially infusing personality, characteristics, thoughts, feelings into inanimate objects.
Can we ask a question now?
Of course, yes, feel free.
Isn't this the way young children think?
Oh my gosh, I didn't even plant that question. I have a study that I can show you where that exact thing has been studied in small children. Thank you very much, ma'am. I love it when that happens.
Well, my grandchildren are very much into thinking this about everything.
Yes. This woman from Boston University, her name is Deborah Kellerman, she has conducted a series of experiments which essentially conclude that we still have agent detection devices. I'm going to talk about 3 different studies that she's done. And this first one was done with children. Okay, so there's the title of the actual manuscript. You can see that it was published in 2003. It says British and American children's preferences for teleofunctional explanations of the natural world. What do I mean by teleofunctional? Let me tell you. First, the study was conducted with 7, 8, and 10-year-olds in both the United States and the United Kingdom. Now, both of these countries were examined because the idea is that you know, in terms of wealth, in terms of education, in terms of you know, population demographics, the UK and the US are fairly similar. The difference is that the US tends to be hyper-religious, whereas the UK tends not to be hyper-religious. Okay, so she wanted to specifically examine whether or not the presence or minimization of religion in these two different cultures were going to inform how these children responded in this particular study. So these children were shown pictures of living and non-living objects. And they were asked a question about each of these objects, about a particular characteristic related to this object. And they were given a choice between one of two answers. The first answer was more of a physical, an answer relating to the physical properties of the object. Whereas the second answer was what was called teleological. It referred to more of the social or self-serving, an answer that was more social or self-serving. So let me give you an example. Let's say a picture of a sharp and pointy rock was shown to the 7, 8, and 10-year-olds. And the question might be, why is the rock so sharp and pointy? Okay? Now they had to choose between one of two answers. The physical answer, the one that focused on the physical characteristics, might be something like, because years of wind and water changed its shape. But the teleological answer might be something like, so that animals won't sit on it. Okay? Now, which one of these answers do you think the 7, 8, and 10-year-olds overwhelmingly chose? The second one, yeah, exactly. Children, 7, 8, and 10-year-olds in both the United States and the United Kingdom overwhelmingly chose answers that were socially serving or self-serving. Yeah.
One question I would have about that is whether or not that originates with them or is actually a learned behavior from the culture around them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
so the question is that a learned behavior or does that originate from the culture around them? And what the author explained in terms of why she was using those particular age groups is that she wanted to get at these children before they'd had alliance training. So the 7 and 8-year-olds probably hadn't had much, but the 10-year-olds probably started to have a little bit of science training.
yeah, but all of them, in the U.S. at least, all of them are going to be exposed to Walt Disney by then.
Sure, and
Disney very much does bring forward animistic type behavior.
promotes those kinds of ideas, yeah, for sure. And the way to solve that would be to try to get at children before they're even exposed to those kinds of things. But then you deal with how well can you really assess, physical versus teleological in individuals that haven't really developed the ability to speak yet, or make really obvious choices. There's all sorts of experiments that are done with infants in terms of how long they look at something. But the kinds of questions that are being asked here are more difficult if you're trying to access an age of child that's younger than this particular age group. But Kellerman went the opposite direction. She actually started to look at individuals that were older than these children. And so that's the data that I want to talk about next. Okay? In these next two studies, she looked at both undergraduate students at Boston University, and she also looked at about 83 or 84 scientists who had published regularly in the fields of chemistry, geoscience, and physics at a selection of top universities in the United States. Okay, so she asked these same questions with those two populations as well. This first study was with the Boston University undergraduates. This was published in 2009. And these undergraduates were asked the same kinds of questions, and basically, instead of giving them two options, they had to answer true or false. Now, the interesting thing about these studies is that these individuals were required to answer within a very abbreviated time frame. So they didn't have a lot of time to process the question before they had to answer true or false. So for example, the sun radiates heat because warmth nurtures life. The undergraduates had to say true or false within a very quick time frame. And these undergraduates said true.
Oh my God.
Same experiment, as I said, conducted with top physical scientists that have been trained to examine the world around them from a standpoint that is not teleological, that carefully observes phenomenon and breaks them down and collects data in a way that you can objectively analyze the data that you're collecting. Same kinds of questions, okay? Something like, germs mutate in order to become drug resistant? When required to answer quickly, even physical scientists would answer this question in a teleological fashion, okay? So the idea here is that this implies that our default response is to presume that events or objects exist for self or socially serving purposes, without being able to engage our frontal lobe and really critically think about the information that we're trying to process. If we have to make a decision quickly, we immediately go for some kind of teleological explanation. So you see that in 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 18 to 22-year-olds, and presumably these are tenure track faculty members who are in their 40s and 50s, okay? All right. So the idea here is that we still have an agent detection device, that it's a very hard thing for us to override, and it requires practice and diligence and sometimes simply time to process the information. Now you tie this to the idea that humans have theory of mind. Okay, this is an entirely different concept than agent detection devices. Theory of mind is the ability to understand the mental states of others. In other words, I, standing here, can identify with how you are feeling there because I have sat in an audience at an academic talk before. I know that you're trying to process information. When I see you guys going like this, I kind of figure that maybe you're having a hard time processing things. But when I see you go like this, I kind of figure that you're enjoying yourselves or agreeing or having a good time. I can understand the mental states of others, and you as well can understand the mental states of others. So when you pair these two ideas together, this is an article that was written in Science called On the Origin of Religion, written by Elizabeth Kulata. This is a direct quote from this article. She says, if you suspect that an agent was responsible for some mysterious event, and having our theory of mind, our ability to understand the mental states of others, it's a short step to thinking that the agent has a mind like your own. Okay, so if we are going to project that an agent is responsible for designing sharp and pointy rocks and why the sun radiates warmth and why germs become resistant to antibiotics, it's not a long leap for us to think that that agent has a mind like our own. And this is in fact an idea that Darwin agreed with. Okay? In The Descent of Man, which was published in 1871, he said humans would naturally attribute to spirits the same passions, the same love of vengeance, or simplest forms of justice, and the same affections which they themselves feel. Okay? So this is the cognitive psychology origin of religion. Okay? The fact that our minds process information in a way which sort of defaults to a teleological, social, self-serving explanation, where an agent is responsible, which may have a mind like our own. Okay? You guys with me? The second sort of explanation that I can offer turns to social psychology with respect to cooperation. Now, religion promotes the formation of stable groups. Okay? Religion promotes cooperation among strangers. We start to think, okay, well, what makes us better than those weirdos over the hill over there, all right? We don't kill, We don't cheat. We don't covet our neighbor's wives, and we don't boil a calf in its own mother's milk. That's gross. Okay? We start to feel our, group cohesion kind of wrapping around these religious ideas that have been passed on through generations. Okay? Religion also boosts reproductive fitness and survival. Now, I have a picture here of meerkats, not humans. Don't be confused. Those aren't weird-looking humans over there. Those are actually meerkats. Meerkats are a great example of behaviors which have been passed along in order to boost reproductive fitness and survival, but not always of the individual. Meerkats are famous for having a sentinel, and this sentinel changes, from day to day, week to week. It's not always the same individual. But meerkat societies tend to be highly interrelated, okay? So if you're the sentinel for the day, everybody else is hanging out, they're sleeping, they're grooming, they're eating, or something like that, and you're on watch. You don't fall asleep, make sure that you can see the snake coming, or the eagle coming, or whatever it is that might be coming. And when you see that really scary predator, you holler at the top of your lungs and alert the predator to yourself, right? That's really what alert calling and sentinel behavior is all about. You're alerting the predator to yourself so that your relatives can escape. Okay? When we think about this in terms of human society, the fact that religion helps promote stable groups, it reinforces their commitment to each other as members of the same group. So they're not necessarily genetically related, but they are part of our in-group. And so we are more willing to go out on a limb and protect individual members of our in-group than we are of an individual that's not in our in-group. Mormons are a wonderful example of this. They tend to have networks. They got mechanics, they got Mormon mechanics, they got Mormon physicians, they got Mormon lawyers, they got Mormon dentists, they've got Mormon, fill in the blank. And the default is to not go to, the weird Catholic, dentist down the street. You want to go in your in-group. You want to go to the Mormon dentist, okay? And so these kinds of behaviors, when you're promoting inclusive sorts of behaviors, actually increase group stability and can increase what I'm referring to as reproductive fitness and success. Yeah?
So I saw a study on meerkats, and they tracked specific meerkats over time, and they did find that loners who weren't part of the group, or meerkats that had less genetic relatability to others in the group, went on sentinel watch less often. They weren't part of the group as much. Mm-hmm. Basically, I'm not part of this group, I don't care about other people.
Right, I don't have to protect anyone but myself, so you guys fend for yourselves. Yeah.
So isn't that kind of going against this, we're all part of a community that helps each other?
Well, didn't you just say that the meerkats that were loners weren't sentinels? That they didn't really care about the health and well-being of others?
Well, I mean, they came into the group and they like moved.
And so, yeah. So, right. So that's another component that is probably a smaller percentage of the phenomenon that we're talking about here. There are examples of crickets that do the same thing. There are crickets that call really loudly, and then there are crickets that sneak up, and then they're calling like females from across long distances, attracting the bats and the everything that are coming to eat them. And so there are these like sneaker males that like hear the guy calling, walk over and intercept the female, and they're like, "Hey, that was me that was calling. How you doing? You're sexy." And then they get to mate, and then the other guy gets killed by the bat that comes in. So there's definitely instances where that kind of stuff happens. I do agree. And that would boost the reproductive fitness of the sneaker male, but not necessarily of the individual who's trying to play by the rules and calling.
Are there actually data showing that the sentinel who gives the alarm is more likely to be predated upon, because they're often foraging in the same area, and the one who is on watch actually detects the threat first.
Yeah.
And from what I've seen and read about, having some background in this area also, as you know, they don't stick around to wait until everyone
Yeah.
gets off the sinking ship here, you know.
Yep.
They're down the hole.
They just
very
make their
quickly.
call and then they're out of there.
Yeah, exactly.
So that would probably explain, well, one, why would they even call to begin with, right? So there's still that question, you know, why are they even drawing attention to themselves to begin with? But there is that phenomenon. They probably continue to call, not just because they're genetically related to much of the group, but also because they're one of the first ones that are out of there. Yeah, for sure. I didn't realize you guys didn't like the meerkat so much. I'm gonna have to make sure that I keep that one in there. Okay, so continuing on the idea of social psychology and cooperation, there's some really interesting data that shows that humans behave better if they think they're being watched. Okay, so here's another reason why religion may have become so successful once stable human groups were starting to be formed. That humans tend to behave better if they feel like they're being watched. Who here has heard of the Princess Alice study? Oh, good, let me tell you. Okay, so a series of studies was done. This one is a picture from the publication from 2011, but a few iterations of the study have been done. And the main idea here is that children have to perform a task in one of three conditions, all right? The task they have to perform is to stand behind this white line and throw a beanbag, or like, you know, a Velcro-y beanbag to the target where the beanbag will stick, okay? So let's say here's the white line and the target is over there. Not the student or the kid doesn't throw the beanbag while looking at the target. The kid actually has to turn around and toss the beanbag over their shoulder and hit the target in order to get the points that are required to win this experiment. Okay? Really difficult task. Now this task is performed in one of three conditions. The first condition is when there is an adult present in the room. The second condition is when the kid is by himself without any supervision in the room. And the third condition is when the kid is told that Princess Alice is watching, so don't cheat. And then the adult leaves. Now the graph that I'm going to show you on the next slide reveals the data from this experiment, and it shows the percentage of full cheating. Okay, now full cheating is not simply turning around and throwing. It's not simply taking a step forward and throwing. It's actually physically walking to the target and sticking the thing on the target. Okay, full cheating. All right, so what we have here, first I'm going to reveal the data. Children were divided into two different age groups. One age group was 5 to 6 years old, and the second age group was 8 to 9 years old. They largely performed approximately the same, so the age difference is not all that interesting in this particular graph. So the graph shows the three groups that I talked about, and on the y-axis is the latency to full cheating. All right, so bigger bars mean that it took longer for the individual to turn around and walk to the target and stick the beanbags on the target. Okay, so when there was an adult actually present in the room, it took, you know, about 3 minutes, 2.5 to 3 minutes in order for that to happen. When there was no supervision in the room, it happened, you know, significantly faster. Right? When there was no one in the room, kids gave up and said, screw it, I'm going to walk over there and put it on. They'll never know. How about the Princess Alice group? The individuals that were told that Princess Alice was watching. Functionally the same as if an adult was present in the room. Okay? The only difference between this group and that group is that the invisible agent group was told that Princess Alice was watching.
Do you know if they told the no supervision group don't cheat, or did they not say anything about that?
The wording was exactly the same. I said that to amp up the theatrical effect. Yeah, I do apologize, but yes, the instructions to all individuals was exactly the same. Yeah. Okay? So humans tend to behave better when they feel like they're being watched, all right? This is an example of how social psychology and group cooperation could have contributed to the development of religion as we know it today. Okay? Now the third example, biopsychological example that I want to talk about is basically my second part of my three-part series condensed into 2 slides, okay? So neurotheology investigates how religion can be explained by activity in the brain, all right? So what we have here is a picture of the brain. And I'm roughly dividing the brain into its 4 lobes. We've got the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the parietal lobe. These lobes are divided by large sulcuses in the brain. All right, so if you look really closely, you can see where these different lobes are divided. We've got this main sulcus right here that divides the temporal and the frontal. We've got this sulcus there that divides the parietal from the occipital, and then we've got another junction that divides the parietal from the temporal and the frontal. All right, well, let me talk about what specifically the parietal and the temporal lobes do. The left side of the parietal lobe provides us with an awareness of the space of one's own body. Okay, so I am looking out at you. I don't have to look down to see where my big toe is. I know exactly where it is without looking. Okay, this is what the left parietal lobe does. The right parietal lobe gives us an awareness of the physical space our body occupies. Okay, so I know that standing here, I'm about 2 feet away from the podium, and I'm several feet away from you. And if I wanted to actually walk over and cheat and put that beanbag on the target, I would have to move my body through space this way in order to move my hand to put the beanbag onto the target. Okay? The communication of the left and right parietal lobes is what enables us to do those things. Now the temporal lobe does many things. We're major Cliff Notes version in terms of what we're talking about for functions here. The left temporal lobe is where our sense of self is located. This is our sense of our personality, of our value systems, of who we think we are. The right temporal lobe is the function of which is a question that Michael Persinger investigates. He wants to know what the right-sided equivalent of the sense of self is. So a section of my talk on neurotheology discusses his research, and I've got a couple of minute-long video that I play that illustrates that. What Michael Persinger has found is that when the right temporal lobe is stimulated, individuals tend to feel or sense a presence in the room. And there's a couple of explanations as to what exactly this is, and one of the kind of off-the-cuff statement that Dr. Persinger makes in the video is that it's the left side sensing the right side being stimulated and generating presences in the room. There's a really remarkable video of a woman who experiences this, but I don't want to go on and on because that's that talk. The critical aspect here is in terms of neurotheology, is the angular gyrus. Okay, that's the red shaded region. The angular gyrus sits at the intersection of the temporal and parietal cortices. When the angular gyrus is stimulated, it disrupts the connection between the parietal lobes. Remember, the parietal lobes were what gave us our sense of self and the space in which our body occupies, okay? When that junction is disrupted, we tend to sort of feel like we're floating, kind of like we're suddenly connected with everything around us because we can no longer distinguish ourselves from the rest of the space that we occupy. Stimulation of the right temporal cortex, as I said, produces a perception of spiritual entities, but stimulation of the angular gyrus is sufficient to produce out-of-body experiences, that floating up above and feeling like we're connected. Those are two of the top 6 characteristics that people experience when they have out-of-body experiences. All right, so if you're, somebody who is not able to access scientific literature because the scientific literature doesn't exist yet, for example, or if you're somebody who doesn't have access to the internet because maybe you're living in a remote village in Africa or something like that, and you experience a sense of floating and a sense of connection with yourself and those around you, and you have an agent detection system, how might you explain what you've just experienced? Okay? It's not a stretch to think that one might explain it by an agent that has a mind like our own. You have a question?
Is that kind of similar to the dream that people have where they feel like they're falling?
Yes. Yeah. You know, there are some classic characteristics of individuals that have out-of-body experiences. And one of them is floating, right? But then when you're kind of coming back, when that angular gyrus is no longer being stimulated and your connection between the parietal lobes isn't disrupted anymore, then that might result in, you know, the sense of falling again. So does all of this sound reasonable? You can kind of see where religion may have come from, right? Okay, so I spent all this time setting up the story of how religion is kind of understandable and how it came to be so pervasive in our society. But if that's the case, then why are there atheists?
Why do you not need an
Well, we love our
explanation?
sin.
Why do you not need an explanation?
Why? You don't want an explanation?
No,
Do you want me to just skip over you want me to just skip over the slide? I can just skip right over it. Oh!
I
Okay.
don't need an explanation of how the earth began or.
Oh, yeah. you're right.
Why am I different? Why are we different?
What, do you want me to try to tell you?
Yeah.
I don't know you, ma'am, specifically, but I can try in general to
You
differentiate.
can tell us how we got this way so we can make other people get out.
Yeah.
There's no self-serving purpose in that at all. Okay, so why are there atheists? I am going to propose three main theories. I'm sure there are others, and I'm sure that my explanation of these theories is not complete enough for the particular lecture that we have in front of us right now, which is part of the reason why I am working on this book, so that I can expand on these ideas a little bit more. The first of these theories is called cultural scaffolding. So scaffolding, secular thinking, no matter what kind of secular person that you are, the theory is that it requires a bit of cultural scaffolding. And this scaffolding can come in from a variety of different sources. Literacy, reading books, your education. You find a high percentage of atheists among college communities and educated individuals. Your social structure. There are a lot of people who have told me when I give this talk that they never were religious because their parents were never religious. They never went to church. They didn't talk about God or Jesus or the Holy Ghost or Buddha or any of those things. And so that is a form of cultural scaffolding. That scaffolding might serve to pull individuals away from the bias or the default or that natural anchor of how we would typically explain the kinds of things that need explaining. Okay, so that's one theory, cultural scaffolding. A second theory is that atheism may be adaptive to survival in certain contexts. Now, the main idea of genetic evolution of physical traits, is that you don't have to be perfect. You only have to be good enough. You just have to be good enough to get your genes, or in this case, your ideas, into the next generation, okay? So there are three ideas for how atheism may be adaptive for survival. The first is something called frequency dependence. And you may have noticed, I probably should have said this when I first started, but I've got references to some of the claims that I'm making or the ideas that I'm sharing with you down at the bottom of the slide. And if you're interested in reading more any one of these references, just let me know and I can give you the full citation. All right, so frequency dependence. This theory states that atheism is a selected strategy right alongside theism. And as long as they aren't too numerous in the population, then religion can continue to, be robust and propagated within the population, right? Atheism may be present, but only at a very small frequency. And if we observe current human culture today, atheists are still the smaller percentage of individuals in the entire world population. A second explanation may be ecological variation. This one states that atheism may actually outperform the idea of religion in certain contexts, in certain settings. What's a great example of how atheism would outperform theism in a context? Well, yes, today. Right, so I'm speaking to a biased crowd, I agree. But science, right? seeking explanation for the things that we observe by objectively examining the phenomena around us, rather than simply saying that, you know, being in the sky floating on the cloud probably did it, moving on, right? So there are certain contexts in which a viewpoint that tends to be atheist would be more successful in certain contexts. Then there's this kind of strange idea called religious reinforcement. This is the idea that in order to boost your commitment and enthusiasm to religion, you have to have a certain number of people who are spouting the opposite in order to make your belief a little bit more strong.
We're doing our part.
Yeah, exactly. Good job. Maybe if we just stop talking, it'll go away. Just kidding. Just kidding. Third theory. Oh, yes.
There's also the social motivation that if you don't follow my belief, you die. A big motivator to be aligned with the religious belief, even if you don't have it.
Yes. Yeah, and I touch on that briefly a little bit later on in the talk, but
sorry.
that, no, that's okay, that's okay. No, that is also a huge motivating factor. You know, one of the things that keeps coming to mind is ISIS, right? I mean, ISIS has started to become more successful because they make these pleas to people to carry out their work in different areas of the world. You know, the recent Charlie Hebdo attack was due to influence of this particular ideology propagating itself in the middle of Paris. You know, so that is. Am I getting ahead of myself? I feel like I'm going to talk about this in a few slides. But you know, those are certainly ideas that are not worth discounting. That is another way of propagating those ideas. Do you have a question?
I just wanted you to touch on the religious reinforcement reason one more time for why there are atheists. Because it almost sounded like you said atheists exist because it helps boost religion.
You heard correctly.
Which sounds like an agency sort of.
You heard correctly, yes. That is one particular way that atheism could be adaptive for survival. I think it's kind of kooky. The authors of this paper postulate that as a mechanism for why atheism would continue to thrive, is that you gotta have atheists in order for religious people to feel more comfy.
That implies that they allow us to be atheists,
Yeah.
or God wants us
They
to be
can't
atheists.
stand the different
I'm
views.
trying to be a biased presenter of information here, people.
I'm skeptic of that.
That's good. Don't start for you.
Before we go too much further, I don't understand what scaffolding means.
Okay.
I know what a scaffold is.
Yeah,
What
so
is-
think about that in terms of ideas, right? So individuals that read, individuals that seek higher forms of education, say college education and beyond, individuals that were raised in families that were never religious, those experiences serve to kind of pull us away from the default, which is to attribute, to a belief in the supernatural,
You know,
basically.
like social progress?
I wouldn't necessarily categorize them that way.
Mimetic imitation.
You could call it that, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so basically it's the idea that there's some experience, something in your environment that provides a framework for which the ideas about atheism can flourish. Scaffolding. Does that make sense? A little bit more sense? Okay. The last theory that I'm going to talk about is a theory about cognitive variation, and that's the theory that atheists and secular thinkers simply have different cognitive characteristics and personalities than people who are non-atheists. Okay, now this seems kind of like it might fit. These characteristics tend to be individual, or atheists tend to be a little bit more individualistic. Okay, they don't necessarily seek comfort of thinking similarly as individuals around them. They tend to be skeptical and nonconformist. Okay, this new flourishing of atheist groups that I've seen in the Sacramento and Stockton and San Francisco areas is just wonderful, because typically getting atheists together is kind of like herding cats, right? It's kind of hard to get them all together and to talk about their ideas, because in general they tend to be very individualistic and nonconformist. The other idea is that atheists and secular thinkers in general may have a larger component of what's called systematizing thinking than empathy. Now, I don't want to say that people who are atheists don't have any feelings and don't care about the well-being of others. That's not what I'm saying. But when you actually operationally define systematizing versus empathy, what we're talking about is that empathy is really the mechanism by which we are able to understand other human beings. But systematizing is a method where we try to understand the inner workings of a system, right? Or a component of something, or, you know, typically we're talking about a machine. But those characteristics serve scientists well when trying to investigate our physical world or our psychological world, in my case. Okay, so if you've got a collection of individuals as atheists that tend to have these characteristics whereby they enjoy deliberative reasoning and logical analysis, then they may tend towards using that kind of thinking as a general way of life rather than turning primarily to empathy. There's a really interesting article that I haven't read thoroughly yet, but the idea, and it was published just last year, I think, where an individual examined autistic people and their religious compunctions. Now, autistic individuals tend to have less empathy and tend to be more systemizing in their thinking. And so the idea was, okay, well, if this is a characteristic of atheists, whether autistic or not, are there going to be a higher percentage of secular autistic individuals versus individuals that aren't autistic? And the results suggest that, yes, autistic individuals tend to have more atheistic tendencies than do non-autistic people. It's a very preliminary result. There's not, you know, I wouldn't necessarily go home and you know, continue spouting this idea to you know, friends and relatives and autistic individuals, but it's at least a very interesting suggestion. Yeah.
Have there been studies of the correlation in the rise of autism, which we know is rising in frequency?
That's a great question.
And the rise
of atheism. So the rise in, pardon me?
Rising in frequency or diagnosis?
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's always the question, and you know, environmental precursors and you know those kinds of things. Yeah, but that's a great question, and I'm not familiar with any research that examines that specifically. Yeah.
This is a joke we just had back here. Are you sure you're talking about atheists or engineers?
That is a good joke. Yeah. You and then I can get a question.
Just so that atheists don't have all the known. Is there any correlation between schizophrenics and religious belief?
Yeah, I've heard very, you know, correlationally that schizophrenics actually tend to have a higher belief in religion versus non-schizophrenics. But you know, again, this is but that's the tendency that's at least that I've read about. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, actually, too, just quickly,
Sure.
autism
And then I saw a hand back there too.
Autism is a spectrum, so in a lot of places lower down on the spectrum, frankly, I don't think that's really meaningful.
Yep,
These are
totally
individuals who are not capable intellectually of understanding what religion entails and what non-theistic approaches entail.
Yep. So that's the point of the preliminary result. There's still a lot that needs to be investigated, you know, but at least initially that's the suggestion, but there's still a lot of questions to ask.
And in terms of empathy, this is something that's a construct. You have to look at how it's measured, of course, and not just what happens on a questionnaire and correlationally. Look at the actual behavior, I would suggest. I would guess that the non-theists, in some respects anyway, if not all respects, would be showing more empathy and having a scientific and humanistic and compassionate understanding of the world, that generally being more tolerant than religious people are, for example. So you have to actually look at perhaps the behavior.
Is that a difference in seeing a larger picture?
What you're getting at,
empathy through systemization?
Yeah, what you're getting at, and that's, I tend to agree with that.
It's not a dichotomy.
Right, there is definitely an overlap.
Yeah.
But what we're talking about is how people choose to engage in their society and behave on the outside, right? And but what I'm talking about in terms of personality characteristics is how they process the information that they're exposed to. And those, while not unrelated, can be thought of as two different sides of the coin.
I guess I would disagree with that.
Okay. That is okay.
And it all comes down to behavior.
I agree.
Thank you.
So there was a question back there, and then, yeah. Any hand raised? Back there? No? Okay. Go ahead.
Just one more thing on that. When you were mentioning that, I was thinking to myself, the process of systematizing things, sometimes the motivation is empathy because we want to understand how things work so we can make it better for everybody. So those to me are not verses. You can't really say verses. Maybe that's
Systematically, we work better together, right? We all like each other.
Yeah.
This world.
We're not talking about mutually exclusive concepts here by any means. We're just talking about, two different ways of,
Personality style.
yeah, exactly, processing information. One more question, then I'll move on.
Let me ask, how is atheist defined in this structure or definition? Is it someone who announces that they're an atheist or one who has atheistic tendencies? Because I have a stepfather who goes to church, basically goes along to get along, but has absolutely no truck with any type of supernatural at all. So is that person an atheist? Is that what?
Yeah, so, as we know, secular thinking has a spectrum as well, and atheist is just one part of that. There are many different secular thinkers, and the individuals in this particular paper that Elizabeth Caldwell-Harris is talking about are more the atheist tendency kind of individuals that you're talking about, rather than people who are absolutely claim without a doubt there is no God. That would be like the classic definition of an atheist. Okay, I want to move on and we can definitely do more questions once we get to the end. These last few slides that I'm going to talk about is how evolution, or how religion itself has evolved over time. So where we've gotten so far in this talk is that as a cultural idea and custom, religion evolved via means. And also that religion may have biopsychological antecedents. We specifically talked about agent detection systems. We talked about cooperation and group cohesion, promoting the development of religion. And we also talked about how human brains are structured for what I'm terming here religion-centric experiences. Okay, one of the things that I highlight in my talk, the neurotheology talk, is that out-of-body experiences aren't necessarily religious experiences, right? Individuals can have out-of-body experiences without interpreting them as religious. So when I say religion-centric experiences, what I'm talking about are experiences that individuals may interpret as religious, even if they aren't specifically religious. Okay? One thing that we haven't talked about is that religion has evolved to better adapt to a variety of things. Religion has evolved to better adapt to different cultures. So what we have there standing in front of the American flag are children of different cultures within the United States. Oops. There we go. Religion has evolved to adapt to different geographic locations. You tend to find certain religions in certain geographic locations versus others. Changes in political climate, which I'm going to expand upon in the next few slides, as well as the changes in the needs of its members, which I'm also going to expand upon in the next few slides. But the picture that I have here is the most recent cover of the Charlie Hebdo magazine that was published after the attacks a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, I'm not sure, I don't think I'm going to say anything more on that. Religion has evolved to better adapt to a variety of conditions. I'm going to talk about a couple of different sources of information for how religion has evolved over time. The first one was an article that was published at the University of Washington, the daily newspaper, and in it, 3 scholars were discussing how their particular religion had changed. Christianity, and this was published in 2009, Christianity has 34,000 denominations. Okay? It is probably one of the most successful means.
And they're all right.
And they're all right. How on earth can there be so many denominations? Well, there are some that are cultural or nationally based, right? after the American Revolution, Episcopalians split from the Anglicans, and after the Civil War, Baptists split into Northern and Southern Baptists. Okay, and they each have slightly different ideas and viewpoints. There are also different denominations that are based off theological differences. Protestants do not include the Apocrypha, which are those 15 books in the Bible that are present in most Bibles except for Protestant Bibles. And then with respect to predestination, the idea of predestination, Calvinists believe that everything is predestined, whereas Arminian Protestants don't believe in predestination at all. And they can all be captured under the umbrella of Christianity, okay? So Christianity in and of itself has moved and shaped and shimmied over the course of several thousand years to fit with whatever population was practicing that religion at that time. Judaism has also changed. Instead of 3 daily sacrifices, Jews tend to pray 3 times a day, which is probably easier to do. I'm guessing. There are sects that are based on region. In Eastern Europe, Judaism is called Ashkenazi. In Western Europe, specifically like Italy, Spain, and some parts of France, Judaism is called Sephardic Jews, and in the Middle East there are the Mizrahi Jews. Now there are slight differences among these different sects. Ashkenazi, for example, observe Passover. Sephardic observe Passover. They don't eat legumes, grains, millet, or rice, but quinoa is apparently accepted. And Sephardic Jews have absolutely no prohibition against any kinds of foods. So the idea is that different sects of Judaism probably have the same prayers, but they have different tunes. They might have different books, or they might have the same books with different covers. They might have the similar dress code, but just different colors within the dress code, or different rules within the dress code. So they're just the way the religion expresses itself based on the area in which you are experiencing that particular religion has changed. In Islam, there are 2 main portions of the Quran. We've got the Meccan verses when Muhammad was in Mecca, and we've got the Medinan verses when Muhammad was in Medina. Medina, thank you. In the Meccan verses, the earlier verses, these focus on the beginning of Islam. They focus on inner peace, inner solitude, as the Prophet Muhammad was part of the minority in Mecca. Okay? These teachings were in direct opposition to what was to the polytheistic thinking at the time. And early Muslims were persecuted and remained closeted. So a lot of these earlier verses are going to focus on, purity and laying the framework for Islamic thinking. Later on, when we get to the Medinan verses, these were discovered or revealed after Muhammad escaped from Mecca and when he became the leader of Yathrib, or also known as Medina. And so these verses are going to focus more on political and societal structure. They very much focus on, laying the groundwork for how to behave in society now that they were able to practice without hiding behind doors. Okay, so the verses in the Quran are focused on current events that were happening at the time. A survey that was conducted by the Pew Forum called the U.S. Religious Landscape Survey. This was done in 2008 and was redone recently in 2012. Surveyed over 35,000 Americans on their attitudes about belief and religion. Okay, so this is a snapshot of the kinds of religions that were surveyed in this particular questionnaire. And the main findings are that Americans have become religiously a bit more flexible over the course of time. So what do I mean by more flexible? Americans have become less dogmatic in their religion. Okay, 70% of respondents agree that many religions, not just their own, can lead to eternal life. There were 2 religions who felt that their way was the only way. You guys guess which 2 they were. And Jehovah's Witnesses. You guys nailed it, first 2 guesses. Nice job.
Baptists are pretty stubborn.
Yeah, I'm sure. So Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses believe that their religion alone was the only way to road to salvation.
This is why they show up on our doorsteps.
So my fiance is ex-Mormon. He hasn't been Mormon in about 20 years, and he still receives phone calls. He even had someone come to the door recently, and I opened it, and I was like, someone for you, and he was like, I shut the door. Yeah, over 20 years, and they're still calling him. Americans tend to be less rigid about their religion. Over 67% of respondents felt that there was more than one way to interpret the tenets of their particular Bible. There were 2 who felt that there was only one valid interpretation. You get 1 guess. Which 2? Same 2. Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. There is only one way to interpret these things.
Is that just, I'm sorry, is that just the people responding who, that's the result is not necessarily saying this is like what your religion says? It's
Yeah.
People responding.
So there was a questionnaire that was given to over 35,000 individuals, and these are, and it's not necessarily, are you less rigid? You know, that's not necessarily the question. I mean, there's many different ways to ask the same kind of question to get more, accurate responses. And so the overall conclusions of this particular survey, yeah, exactly, exactly.
The funny thing about Mormons, though, is that if you ask them about their religion, they'll say, no, our religion does not say we don't like gay people, but every Mormon dislikes gay people. So...
Can't help you there.
This is interesting in that must mean that Muslims in America are also less dogmatic and less rigid. Yeah, because I think because of all the misconceptions about Islam by Americans, they would think that they were really rigid or something. But
Maybe they didn't have to.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of pre-ISIS, right? Maybe things, well, not pre-ISIS, but, pre-ISIS becoming really, so who knows, maybe that would be different now, yeah.
The thing to understand about most people who are Muslims in the United States is that they're refugees from secular governments that were in Muslim countries rather than religious advocates. And so that's probably why you get that lack of that kind of response.
Yeah, there could be explanations for that. Individuals tend to be less certain about whether or not God exists. Over 70% of respondents were absolutely certain that God exists. 93% of those respondents were Jehovah's Witnesses, and 90% were evangelical. Thank you. Sorry, it's late. I got to work at 7 this morning. And Mormons as well. 22% were less certain, but 41% of those, what's 22% of 35,000? Never mind. You didn't think you were going to have to math tonight.
7,000.
Thank you. So 41% of 7,000 were Jews, 39% of 7,000 were Buddhists, and interestingly, so 57% were Hindus, but that was the 2012 figures. In 2008, the proportion of Hindus that were less certain about the existence of God was down to 43%. So in that 4-year period, the percentage of Hindus went up fairly substantially, which is interesting. Okay, but here's another interesting side note. Here's a portion of the survey. This is the conception of God portion of the survey. We've got net belief in God, right? So the total number of individuals in each of those categories. But then the belief in God is divided into whether or not you believe in a personal God, an impersonal force, or I'm not really sure. Here's what I found interesting. I don't think those atheists are doing it right.
Something wrong with the survey.
If they didn't understand the question.
It could be a person.
So there are some errors with the survey that, bear, a reiteration perhaps in another 2 years. Yeah, agnostics, 55% of them believe in God. And agnostics I can understand a little bit better. They're on the fence. They're not really sure. But atheists, I thought atheists were supposed to, vehemently deny. Okay, all right. Now we get into semantics. I understand. Yeah.
There's probably a category of
No.
things that
Maybe.
atheists can also involve deists.
That's true.
What were the numbers? What percentage of people surveyed fell into those categories?
Fell into atheist, agnostic. So the whole unaffiliated section of the survey was about 16% of that 35,000.
16%.
So I don't know specifically about atheists, but 16% fell into the unaffiliated category, which is represented by atheist, agnostic, secular unaffiliated, and then religious unaffiliated. Here's one of the final points. So my talk has actually gone more than 45 minutes, but it's great because there have been questions throughout, which I really enjoy. One of the final points of my talk tonight is that individuals are also showing that they are less static. What that means is that many individuals, 44% of respondents, are no longer practicing the religions in which they were raised. Okay, so they were raised a particular religion. 44%, nearly half of those 35,000 people, no longer practice the religion in which they were raised. And specifically, the ratio of individuals changing from whatever they were to the unaffiliated category, the category that was atheist, agnostic, and secular, was 3 to 1. So 3 times as many people are changing to the unaffiliated category for every one person that's changing to something else. Okay? Less static. Americans tend to be less static in their religion. Related to that point, this author, George Barna, published a book in 2002, I think. I didn't write that down. Where he tracked 15 adults over the course between 1991 and 2001. And what he found is that people tend to leave rigid religions for religions that are a bit more personalized. And he expanded on that by saying that individuals tended to pick and choose various characteristics and qualities from the different religions to assemble one that they feel comfortable with, that's more personalized to them. He went so far as to make the statement that we are a nation headed for 310 million people with 310 million religions. Okay? So this last segment of the talk was about how religion itself has evolved over time. Okay? And religion, just like a physical characteristic surviving in a particular environment, it ebbs and flows. It changes based on the needs of the population, based on what's popular at the time, based on certain current events that are happening. And overwhelmingly, the current trend tends to be more individuals becoming more flexible, a little less certain about their dogmatic beliefs, and transitioning into an ideology that isn't reflective of any one particular religion, but is in fact reflective of all or none. Okay, so that, to me, is a very hopeful transition. So let me start with some overall conclusions before I make my final point. What we've talked about tonight is that religious memes conferred an evolutionary advantage that were passed from generation to generation. We also talked about how biopsychological traits of humans may have increased the probability that religion would propagate among human culture. We talked about how atheists are an emerging population brought forth through cultural scaffolding, through adaptation, and through differences in personality characteristics. Excuse me. And And we also talked about, at the very end, that religion is not done evolving. It's continuing to change and flux as the people who are practicing these religions change and adapt. The structure of religion adapts to the general trend of its believers. Now here's the main point that I wanted to make. I taught a sensation and perception class about a year ago. And when I was preparing for that talk, I stumbled upon this video by a man named Bo Lotto. This was great for my color vision segment of sensation and perception because he did a 20 or 30 minute TED talk using all sorts of different optical illusions, which was great. But one of the things that he said I thought was an amazing analogy to religion. He said that light hitting our retina, that's all that vision is. It's just light hitting our retina. And that light is inherently meaningless. It's what we do to the light that gives it meaning. Structures in our retina transduce the light into electrical signals that our brains then interpret. How each of us interprets that light is different. It varies widely from person to person based on their representation of cones and rods. What I think of as green might look completely different to you. You might call it yellow. In fact, you probably have those conversations with people. That's blue. No, that's purple. What are you talking about? That's green. Okay? Our interpretation of what is essentially the exact same light is different from person to person. And I think this is a really great analogy to religion because I don't think the information itself is harmful. I don't think the idea that there may be a higher power that's guiding an individual's life isn't in itself dangerous. It's when we start using that to pass laws that restrict the rights of individuals in your society around you. When you start commandeering planes and driving them into buildings, when you start promoting the idea that individuals in different countries take out their disrespect of that particular religion on the individuals, the innocent bystanders around you. That is, I think, a harmful and dangerous interpretation of these ideas of religion. But the information that I presented this evening was my attempt in showing you that it's actually not that hard a stretch of the imagination to think why we have religion present in so many of our cultures and so many believers in society today. What I would like to focus my efforts on, and what I hope that after today you're considering focusing your efforts on, is not converting everybody to think the exact same way that we do, because how is that different than what others have done? What I would like to encourage you to do is think about acceptance, can we all just get along? But, more importantly, that you can believe what you believe as long as you're not waving it around and passing laws and preventing other people from marriage equality and, those kinds of things, preventing people from accessing birth control because they belong in the kitchen, or, any of those kinds of ideas that are often given religiously motivated justifications. And that's all I have. You've been asking questions throughout the entire talk, but I'm happy to take any more if you guys have some. Yes?
When does your book come out?
Yeah. I get asked that every time. I have been working 2 full-time jobs for the last 3.5 years.
Oh.
And as of this fall, I will be working entirely at Sac State, and I will have much more time to focus not only on developing these talks, but compiling them into a book. So my goal over the next, say, year or 2 would be to get that written and try to find a publisher for me. Matt McCormick is a good friend. He actually has published his book, and so I've been picking his brain about doing that kind of stuff. But my UC Davis job, which wasn't mentioned tonight, that's the job that I will no longer have, is the job that's been taking up a lot of my book writing time. I'll just leave it at that.
Damn.
I know. Any other questions?
This is way off topic, but you're talking about the parietal lobe and how it can make you sense with the parietal, make you sense the presence of another person. Do you have any idea if that's related to the idea of, you heard of night terrors where people wake up and they feel like they're awake and there's a presence in the room, but they can't wake up from their dream? And
Yeah, so one of the study subjects in the video that I played for that talk kind of addresses that point. So has anybody ever, so sleep paralysis is a big component of one of the characteristics of out-of-body experiences. And sleep paralysis, happens all night long, right? Or sorry, when you're in REM sleep, sleep paralysis happens because that's when you're dreaming and you have all these really vivid dreams, and you don't want to be acting them out. That would be very bad, right? But sleep paralysis can also carry over. There's two phases of sleep. One's called hypnagogic and one's called hypnopompic. And they basically describe going from waking to sleep and going from sleeping to wake. So there's those in-between phases where people can actually be sort of lucid and experiencing sleep paralysis. And that's often associated with a heightened level of fear because you can't move. You're sort of awake and cognizant, but you can't move. And that's also when that angular gyrus is basically disrupted, right? And it disrupts the connection between the two parietal lobes, and we start to sort of feel that sensation of floating. The very first time I was preparing my neurobiology of religious experiences talk, I had an out-of-body experience when I was waking up. And I don't know, I didn't interpret it as religious as other people do, but it was actually very peaceful. I was floating, and a long-lost dog that died like 5 years before was like following me around, like watching me, like float around the house. And then I floated into what was my bedroom at the time, and my fiance was lying in the bed, and I looked, and I basically floated back down and fell asleep, and I woke up hours later. So, this whole idea that these experiences can happen while we're sleeping is very well established, and there's an example that I give in that talk where I talk about somebody who had a similar situation as that. It's a very long-winded answer, but does that answer your question?
Awesome, yeah.
Okay, good.
Does this also have anything to do with what a lot of people refer to as the near-death experience?
Yes.
A lot of people have experienced the same things.
Out-of-body, near-death experience is a subset of out-of-body experiences. So, think about if part of your brain is disrupted and it disrupts the connection between, the different parietal lobes. One situation in which that might happen is when you've experienced some substantial physical bodily injury. And so near-death experiences are an example of out-of-body experiences, but they don't always happen when you're near-death.
I know a lot of people that actually will use that as an argument for their religion. Because
A neuroscientist, in fact, published a book.
Yeah.
We actually went to Vesta recently, I think, and did a whole talk about it, the Gallows of Art.
Yeah, you went to hear the guy, the
I
author?
saw him talk on Oprah, but
Oh.
I
Yeah,
did not go to that.
that book did not make
He
me
said he
happy.
went from being atheist to being religious due to his near-death experience.
Yeah,
Kind of crazy.
because he was guided by a
There's like a fairy kind of
Fairy
experience that he was
half
talking
naked
about, his
spirit.
death experience.
right. Question and then question.
You talked about kind of the propensities to believe in spooks and stuff like that, but what makes people gullible in the presence of a religious founder? Why do they believe that this person actually has the thing they're looking for? Yeah.
Charismatic people have an easier time convincing people than non-charismatic people. Religious leaders tend to be very charismatic. Think about a charismatic person that you've met that has nothing to do with religion. Were you more apt to believe what they were saying versus somebody who you didn't think was very charismatic? There are qualities, in my introductory psychology class, I talk about, information that we receive and how easily do we believe information that we get from attractive people versus unattractive people. People who are wearing white lab coats versus people who are wearing regular street clothes. People who are older versus people who are younger. We have certain biases about who we receive information from. And charismatic people, there is no, dull hermit person who ever launched a worldwide religion. They're always very charismatic. There was another question, first you and then you.
Yeah, I was wondering, what is the distinction between the out-of-body experience and the experience of awe? Because there's a...
You mean like shock and awe? You mean that? Or?
No, the awe of God, the awe you experience when you're in a natural place, things like that.
Got it. out-of-body experience, so the question is, what's the difference between sort of a general
What
wonderment?
I remember is that a lot of people who were Christians back in the 70s and the 60s did not make reference to out-of-body experiences, but the experience of awe and presence of God.
Out-of-body experiences have very characteristic experiences. So that sense of floating, feeling at peace and one with your universe around you. Oftentimes people have visions. The angular gyrus is also connected to the occipital lobe. So there are stories about young children who have out-of-body experiences that don't see grandma, that don't see their long-lost pet. They see Big Bird and Mickey Mouse, right? So it's kind of like, who are you thinking of at the time? So there are very characteristic things that you might not necessarily experience if you go on a really nice hike and you get a great view of the Sierra Nevadas or something. But there's no sense of floating, there's no sense of, they're feeling one. That's very different than appreciating your surroundings.
But they're both experiences that we might tell
They're both-
associated some
Teleological.
Yeah.
The thing is that all of a sudden what we've got now is that an experience, a psychological experience, has basically shifted from one standard to another standard for how you experience God within, in my understanding, my frame of reference.
I thought your question was, what's the difference between a feeling of awe and out-of-body experiences?
Right, but the thing is that what I'm getting at is that there's something else going on here, because awe was the basic term. If you go in, especially in Christianity, is that you hear the word awe all the time. You don't hear about this spiritual one thing with God, because that's essentially a component of one aspect of Protestantism.
We may be getting into...
Awe is actually an experience far widely experienced in Protestantism.
Sure, but you may be getting into a language issue. The terminology for out-of-body experiences wasn't even really suggested until, I think it was William James who first suggested it in the 1900s.
Yeah.
So we may be getting into, maybe the terminology for out-of-body experience wasn't really available, and so people are categorizing it as the way you're describing.
Are you talking the difference between I feel a sense of wonder or the real Pentecostal, the ecstasy, the glossolalia, the filled with the Spirit sort of?
No, there's a whole
Speaking in tongues or something, that kind of thing?
That basically deals with, that came out in, the Sierra Club's magazine has this just recently about the science of awe. And essentially, it's coming out of the same type of experiences that she's describing here for the out-of-body experience. And so the thing is I'm basically saying, well, are we just sitting, what we've really done is basically take one conceptual framework and allow it to shift over to another one for how we religious experience it.
I would say no. And I would say what you're talking about is just a misclassification of what I'm talking about versus what others might be experiencing. Not having read the article that you're referring to, that would be...
I can't defend it.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not my field.
I think you had the next question, and then I saw many other hands up.
I think we're actually running out of time, so I'll have to take one more and
Wow.
then...
That went fast. That was
Yeah,
fun,
I know,
guys.
it went super fast.
Go ahead.
And I did actually read that article.
Oh, you did?
You're talking about an emotional state here, but,
Yeah.
that gets very subjective. Anyway, just quickly on the drugs, well, the issue of the hallucinations and the out-of-body experiences, you can experience hallucinations just taking sometimes over-the-counter drugs when you're sick and you get a fever, you get these weird things. When I was a kid, that happened to me.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting. I could see this, and I knew it wasn't happening. And I knew it must be because I was sick and had a fever and was taking drugs and all this. But you can see how primitive people,
Yep.
Eating some kind of plant that had hallucinogenic effects, like a lot of them did, right?
Yep. My second one of my talk talks about ketamine.
There we go.
And the receptor specifically that's involved in out-of-body experiences with respect to ketamine.
There we go.
Yeah.
Prescription drugs too, of course. Yes, and then just quickly on how your comment on how some experts suggest and point out many cases where religion, in fact, leads to conflict, sometimes within the group. I mean, look at how many thousands of versions of Christianity, and we don't have to go very far to look at Shias and Sunnis, etc., Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, and in history as well as with automatically creating more likelihood of conflict with all various outgroups by creating more in-groups and out-groups, right?
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And if someone could just take a step back, take a 30,000-foot view and just see what's happening, then, you know, maybe this would all go away, but I don't see that happening.
We're going in the right direction anyway.
I think so, too.
Becoming more science-based, which is great.
Yeah, I mean, wasn't it last year's State of the Union address where Obama included secular thinkers
Yes.
in his State of the Union? I mean, so, and what was it the other night? Transgender? Transgender? Yeah, so, whew, way to go. All right, thank you very much, everybody.